Now on BBC One Scotland, in the run-up to next month's elections, what are the big issues facing Scotland? Well, it's the Leaders' Debate, chaired by Sarah Smith.
We're at the start of what is likely to be a campaign like no other. The politicians are here. Now it's time to hear from the people at the heart of this election. That's you, the voters. Welcome to the first Leaders' Debate of the 2021 election for the Scottish Parliament. I have with me the leaders of Scotland's larger political parties to answer questions for the next hour. You'll know all of them already, I'm sure, but let me introduce them. We have with us the leader of the Scottish National Party, Nicola Sturgeon. The leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Douglas Ross. Scottish Labour's leader, Anas Sarwar. One of the co-leaders of the Scottish Greens, Lorna Slater. And the leader of the Scottish Liberal Democrats, Willie Rennie. Please welcome them all now to the show. And a very warm welcome to our audience as well, who, as you're no doubt used to seeing by now, are all joining us from the comfort and safety of their own homes. Now, you'll probably notice there is a bit more physical distance between those of us who are on the stage tonight too. That's, of course, due to social distancing. But we are grateful that the party leaders did agree to all come together here tonight for the benefit of you at home. Our virtual audience represents a wide range of Scottish public opinion on party lines, on some of the key issues, and to represent the length and breadth of the electorate. We're live on both BBC One Scotland and the BBC News Channel. And before we came on air, all the parties randomly selected the order in which they would each make a short opening statement. Well, the party who selected the first statement were Scottish Labour. And so to firstly give us your opening statement, Anas Sarwar, on the question is, you have 45 seconds to tell the audience why should they trust you with your vote on May the 6th.
This year has been the hardest of our lifetime. That's why this election must be about you, your family and our national recovery. Not egos, settling scores or going back to the old arguments. Scotland deserves better than that. Coming through COVID, we can choose something different. Alongside defeating the virus, I am determined to restart our economy and create jobs, restore our children's education and look after their mental health, and renew our NHS so that it never again has to choose between treating a virus or treating cancer. I will focus on what unites us as a country, not what divides us, so that together we can build a fairer and stronger Scotland.
Anas Sarwar, thank you very much. And next up is Willie Rennie from the Liberal Democrats. You have 45 seconds to tell us, the audience, why they should trust you with their vote on May the 6th.
After the year that we've endured, I want to spend every second, every moment of the next 5 years of the Parliament focusing on putting the recovery first. That means cutting mental health rates. It means bounce-back support for pupils in school. It means creating jobs for people desperate for work, and it means taking action on the climate. This is not the moment for another referendum. We need to put the divisions behind us and bring the country together. I've got 15 years experience in Parliament in London and in Edinburgh, 10 years leading my party. I've built bridges, I've got things done. I can deliver this. So if you want to put recovery first, vote for me and the Scottish Liberal Democrats.
Willie Rennie, thank you very much. Next up is Lorna Slater of the Scottish Greens. Tell people at home why they should trust you with their vote on the 6th of May.
In this election, our future is at stake. The pandemic has highlighted that Scotland's economy is propped up by low wages, insecure work, and a social security net that's full of holes. We must not go back to this broken system. Science tells us that we have less than 10 years before the climate breakdown goes past the point of no return. The time to act is now. The Scottish Greens have a plan for a fair and green recovery. By investing in public transportation, renewable energy, warm homes, and restoring our natural environment, we can create tens of thousands of jobs and tackle the climate crisis. The time to vote Green is now. It's time to vote like our futures depend on it.
Lorna Slater, thank you very much. Now we turn to Douglas Ross of the Scottish Conservatives. So you've got 45 seconds. Why should people watching trust you with their vote?
COVID has affected us all. We're still battling through the health and the economic crisis, and now we've got to focus on rebuilding Scotland and focus on delivering opportunities for the next generation. Like my wee boy Alistair, like your kids and your grandkids, your nieces and nephews. Now, while all the parties tonight are speaking about recovery, there's one big difference. The SNP want to take us through another divisive independence referendum, and the Scottish Conservatives want to stop them. The future of our country is at stake. So if you want to stop that referendum again, if you want to protect jobs, restore schools and rebuild Scotland's economy, then vote Scottish Conservative.
Douglas Ross, thank you. And lastly, we'll turn to Nicola Sturgeon. You've probably got the hang of the question now. Why should voters trust you with their vote?
Well, these are serious times and they demand serious leadership. Over the past year, I've done my best every single day to lead us through this pandemic. In asking you to re-elect me and the SNP, I offer you this continued strong leadership to guide us through crisis. COVID is not over yet. We need an experienced hand at the wheel. Bold policies to drive our recovery, like a national care service, a young person's guarantee, more affordable homes, action to tackle climate change and end child poverty. And when the crisis has passed, a choice on independence, so that decisions about our future lie here in Scotland, not with Boris Johnson at Westminster. If you want to secure all of that, do not leave it to chance. Cast both your votes for the SNP on May the 6th.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Now we're going to hand over to the audience. Now, if you're at home and you want to join in the discussion and the debate, use the hashtag BBC Leaders Debate. We want to have a robust and respectful debate tonight, and we're going to get the audience to ask the questions. I'm here to make sure that they get the answers that they're looking for. I'll step in if a point needs clarifying or if I need to bring you back to the question. And a reminder to everyone in our virtual audience tonight, please, I know you've heard this before, but please remember to unmute when I come to you. We've been predicting just how many times we might have to say that throughout the programme. Well, hopefully not now, because our first question comes from Sue Price. Sue, what would you like to ask the politicians?
What is your plan for the economy of Scotland for the next 3 to 5 years? How do you plan to rebuild our economy post-pandemic?
So I'll turn to you first, Douglas Ross. How do you plan to rebuild our economy?
So it's the most important thing we're facing right now is protecting jobs that people have at the moment and protecting people staying in employment and getting people back into work if they lose their jobs, because we know there is an economic crisis looming. So Scottish Conservatives have put forward ideas for a Job Security Council, for a Retrain to Rebuild grant to help people learn the skills they need to get back into work. For our economy wider, we're looking at investment right up and down the country in infrastructure projects and rolling out full fibre broadband to every business and every property by 2027. Those are some of the plans we've got to restore our economy, to fix the mess that we're in right now. But none of that's possible if we have to go through another divisive referendum. We can't have a recovery and a referendum. That's the simple choice that we're facing tonight. So I want to support jobs, I want to protect jobs, I want to invest right up and down Scotland, but that's all under threat if we have another divisive referendum.
Nicola Sturgeon, the question is, what's your plan for the economy of Scotland over the next 3 to 5 years, basically the lifetime of the next Parliament?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's to continue to suppress COVID so that we can get our economy restarted again. Businesses the length and breadth of the country want to start trading, and that's my immediate focus. As we recover our economy, we need to continue to support businesses. We will pay in April start-up grants as businesses start to trade again. We've also guaranteed 100% rates relief for the next financial year for the sectors that are most affected to give vital help for a period longer. We also need to make sure that we are supporting people to reskill. A National Transition Training Fund is one of our policies, as is a young person's guarantee. One of the key things is that we don't allow young people to bear the legacy of this pandemic. And then longer term, a massive investment in infrastructure. 100,000 new affordable homes, which will support 14,000 jobs a year, and aligning our economic recovery with the imperative to tackle climate change. So investment in renewable heating of our homes, in green jobs. And of course, given that we're talking about the lifetime of the next Parliament, trying to get ourselves back into the European single market so that we can trade across Europe freely again, which of course is 7 times the size of the UK market. And being out of that single market, in addition to COVID, is costing our exporters dear.
And to get back into that single market, presumably you mean Scotland becoming an independent country that joins the EU?
Yes, as I said in my opening remarks, only when the crisis is past. I think people can look at me over the past year and know that my absolute focus is on steering the country through COVID. But if we want to make sure that the recovery is in Scotland's hands, that the decisions we take are the ones we want to take, then giving people the choice of independence when the crisis is past is important to make sure that it's not Boris Johnson determining the terms of our economic recovery, it's people who live here in Scotland.
Anna Samar, what would be your plan for the economy of Scotland over the next 3 to 5 years? How would you plan to rebuild our economy post-pandemic?
I think the first thing that's important to say is that we're not yet past this virus, and my condolences go out to all those that have lost a loved one across the country. But Sue hits upon a very important point. This crisis does not end the day lockdown ends or the virus goes away. It will take years to recover the aftermath of COVID. And COVID has hit people equally, whether they were yes, whether they were no, whether they were leave, whether they remain. And that's why we've got to pull our country together. And the idea that the businesses will just automatically, when the shutters go up, as the lockdown ends, will go back to normal is just not credible either. That's why we've got to continue support in a tapered way so they can get back to pre-COVID levels. We've got to recognise our 360,000 of our fellow citizens on furlough, worried about if and when they'll have a job to go back to. We can't have a cliff edge on furlough. We've got to make sure we're investing in the new technologies and the new industries of the future. We've got to make sure it's a recovery that works for everyone. It's got to be a rural, coastal, island, urban economy, north and south recovery. That's why we need to push power out of the Parliament and into regional hubs so they have decision-making power and resources. And crucially, we've got to have a youth jobs guarantee that actually does what it says it's going to do. And that supports young people across our country so they're not out of work for too long, so we can't have a lost generation coming through COVID. That should be our collective priority, not arguments about referendums, not arguments about yes, no, or leave and remain.
Lorna Slater, what would you say to Sue about how you would plan the economy for the next 3 to 5 years?
The Scottish Greens have ambitious plans for a fair and green recovery. We have a vision for a really positive future. You'll find in our manifesto costed policies, which I call three-way wins. They're good for the economy, they create jobs, they're good for the people of Scotland, and they help reduce our emissions. Things like our Rail for All programme, upgrading Scotland's railways so that everyone in Scotland, including in rural areas, has access to affordable, reliable rail travel. Like upgrading Scotland's homes. This is a great way to create jobs whilst reducing people's bills and reducing our emissions. You'll find our manifesto full of these very practical policies. I'm an engineer, I work in renewable energy, and of course a big part of our programme would be investment in renewable energy so that Scotland can create jobs, sustainable jobs that will last us long into the future.
Willie Rennie, how do you plan a post-pandemic economy for the next 3 to 5 years?
Scotland's got many skills, many talents, but the biggest talent of all is its people. And we need to invest in education, reskilling, retraining, giving them the opportunity to find new jobs and opportunities. We've also got some of the world's best universities with some of the best ideas, technology spin-outs, intellectual property. And we need to fully utilise those technologies, including things like hydrogen, which is going to be at the centre of the new energy sources for the future. We need to create a youth jobs guarantee. We need to make sure, though, as we transition out of the pandemic, that we've got the support there for all those hundreds of thousands of people who've been missed out of support altogether. Those people deserve extra support. But the most important thing is that we need to bring the country together. We will not get through this pandemic and we will not get a recovery that benefits everyone if we are arguing amongst ourselves all the time. We need to put the divisions, the arguments, the exhausting arguments of the past behind us and focus on the recovery. If we can do that, I think everybody in this room can make a contribution. So let's unite and get this recovery done together.
OK, well, this is the point at which we cross our fingers and hope the technology works and bring from our audience panel Selwyn in to join the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. Nicola Sturgeon said to me, or said to us, she is focused on COVID and all that goes with it. If that's the case, how did she find time to put an independence bill through Parliament while we're still suffering COVID? That's not a focus.
We'll give Nicola Sturgeon a chance around that. Let's hear from Angelica first.
So my question was very much similar to Selwyn's in that back in November 2020, Nicola Sturgeon was pushing for another independence referendum. So is the focus really on a COVID recovery, or is your focus on a referendum?
Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, if I can answer Selwyn's point, first of all, we haven't put an independence referendum bill through the Parliament. We published a draft, as we said we would. I think it's 9 pages long. I'll leave other people to judge whether my focus has been on the pandemic or not over the past year. People have seen me literally every single day lead the country's fight against COVID, and I have literally spent almost every waking moment doing that rightly and properly, as is my responsibility as First Minister. And I will continue to do that for every single day that is required out of this crisis, because it is not over yet. I've spent the day-to-day not on the campaign trail, but in the Scottish Government headquarters, talking with my clinical advisors, making sure we're continuing to try to take all of the right decisions. But as we come out of this crisis and we focus on recovery, as we need to do, recovery is not a neutral thing. What you recover to, what kind of country you're trying to rebuild, depends on the decisions government takes. And as long as so many of the decisions lie in the hands of Boris Johnson and governments at Westminster that often people in Scotland haven't voted for, then the danger is we take the wrong decisions and go in the wrong direction, just as we've been dragged out of the EU against our will. So these are big decisions, but right now my focus every day is on COVID. The last point I would make, Anna said that COVID has affected everybody equally, and in terms of politics, he's right. But COVID hasn't affected everybody equally. People in poverty, for example, have been affected much more. So part of our economic recovery has to be tackling poverty and inequality as well. It should be a well-being based recovery, which is why other things I'd like to do if re-elected are look at how we pilot and explore things like a 4-day working week to get that balance between work and life better. So there's lots to do.
We'll have time to get into all of that. Let's just go to Partha in our audience to contribute to this.
Thank you, Sarah. I wanted to say that while it has been an unique experience, given nobody had prior experience of the pandemic, at times it has felt like that the public health messaging has been rather inconsistent, and that has had a direct effect on the economy. Maybe one example would be the planning around the Christmas Day leave, and what restrictions. Is there a need for more consistent public health messaging and to message the needs of the health sector with the economic sector and related sectors?
Now, obviously, it's the Scottish Government who've been in charge of that, but we have to make sure everybody gets a fair shout in this debate. So let me go to Anna Sarwar for Labour to talk about how you feel the public health messaging has gone and should continue.
Yeah, to be clear, what I was saying about hitting us all, what I meant was COVID hasn't judged between yes or no, leave or remain. It's about pulling the country back together again. And credit where credit is due. The First Minister has been out every day talking about COVID and trying to lead from the front. But I just fear she has a blind spot when it comes to the Constitution and it comes to the referendum. And it's very noble for Nicola Sturgeon to talk about poverty and poverty being a mission, but she has been in government for 14 years. She has been First Minister for 7 years, and in that time, 1 in 4 children in Scotland live in poverty. In Nicola Sturgeon's own constituency, almost 50% of children live in poverty. And if she obsessed about fighting poverty as much as she did about the Constitution, imagine how different Scotland could be as a result. That's what our collective focus should be on coming through this. Not going back to those old arguments, not fighting about the Constitution, but focusing on what unites us across the country.
Poverty rates are too high, but actually in Scotland they're slightly lower than in other parts of the UK. And one of the things we've done over the past year alone in the UK is establish the Scottish Child Payment, which I want to double in the next term of Parliament. One of the things that is causing child poverty in all parts of the UK to rise again is the assault on welfare and social security from a Tory government at Westminster. That's one of the illustrations of why we need more powers in the hands of Scottish governments of whatever party elected here in Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
Nicola, you had an opportunity to take control of social security powers, but you handed them back
We've just
So
set up
Westminster,
the Scottish child payment.
you
Willie.
delayed the implementation of it by years. You could have dealt with this earlier. So when you get the powers, you do not use them. And that's the trouble with this government. It is focused on the whole constitutional issue. And you make it sound a simple thing. You make it sound as if we can just get independence just like that. But we know it will be a long, divisive argument. We've seen the arguments over the last few weeks with Alex Salmond over these issues. It's going to be bitter. It's going to be divided. It will last for years. It will just be like Brexit. That's the difficulty.
Sarah,
and therefore, that's why we
difference
need to
perhaps...
We need to make sure everybody gets their say, so let's go to Douglas Ross.
Thanks,
Sarah. First of all, what we've heard is, again, politicians arguing amongst each other but not answering the questions we've got. So first of all, to Partha's point, has the guidance been too confusing? Yes. That's why in the first 2 days of this campaign, 2 of Nicola Sturgeon's ministers have had to apologise for breaching the guidance. So it is confusing, there's not a consistent message, and we've got to ensure, as we move forward with the recovery, that we get the right messaging that's easy for people to understand and follow. But Selwyn and Angelica were absolutely right. Now, Nicola Sturgeon is trying to say, well, she didn't pass the bill through Parliament, but she did lodge it in the last few days. So you can't then go on to speak about poverty or education or rebuilding the country when you didn't put forward legislation to tackle poverty. You didn't put forward legislation for our economic recovery. You didn't put forward legislation for an education bill. What happened to that? All of that was put to the side so Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP could push forward with another independence bill.
Wrong.
And it's not factually wrong because the final piece of legislation that the SNP laid in front of Parliament before the Parliament rose for this election was one about independence, because that's their only priority. It's their political priority. We've heard from the studio so far that today it's not the public's priority, and that's where Nicola Sturgeon's wrong. And that's why we can't have a recovery when the SNP and the Scottish Government are only focused on another referendum. Well,
let's go to Jenny in the audience and see what her take is.
Well, first of all, I want to say on COVID, I think that we've done remarkably well. My husband and I had our second vaccinations today, which is incredible. But while you all talk about recovery, I just wonder how you're going to move forward when there are so many empty shops and people desperate to get back to work. And how I just wonder how it's going to be for my grandchildren. Will they ever have the opportunities that I had?
Yep. Nail on the head.
Can I take that one?
Jenny's absolutely right.
Yes, Lorna.
Thank you very much. I've also had my first vaccination. I'm very excited with how well the vaccination programme is rolling out in Scotland. I think this shows the strength of having a fully public NHS, something that I'm absolutely committed to. And the truth is, your children will not have the same opportunities that you had because we are now outside of the European Union. We have lost the ability for young people to use the Erasmus scheme, to be able to travel, work and live in 27 countries around Europe. And I think that is such a shame. Of course, I think it's also very interesting who in this room has been repeatedly obsessing over constitutional issues and who hasn't, for example. I know that the Scottish Greens throughout the COVID crisis have been working very hard for the Scottish people. We pushed from the beginning for testing of frontline workers, teachers and care workers for asymptomatic regular testing. We stopped evictions during the COVID pandemic, and during our budget negotiations, we won pandemic support payments for some of Scotland's poorest families. So these are the kind of things to tackle inequality and to help the recovery that you can expect from the Scottish Greens.
Lorna, thank you for that. So let's move on to our another question from the audience. We've got Jackie Wilson.
Hi, good evening. I'd just like to ask, why can't we actually get through the pandemic instead of just focusing on another referendum?
Nicola Sturgeon.
We are focusing on getting through the pandemic. I mean, let me be clear, I think everybody knows my view that we shouldn't leave our future in the hands of governments that we don't vote for. We should take our future into our own hands. But that will come when we are out of this crisis, because it is important to the rebuilding exercise. But right now, the focus is on getting through the pandemic. Going back to Jenny's question about retail, because of the efforts of everybody across the country, because of the amazing efforts of our vaccination teams in every part of Scotland right now, we will begin to reopen retail services from Monday next week. Hopefully we'll see retail open completely at the end of April, and then we will see a more substantial reopening of our economy as we go into May. That is all possible because of the focus, not just of government. It's government's job to lead, But that's been made possible because of the focus of people right across the country. But, you know, I remember I was in Parliament during the last big crisis, the financial crash and the recession that followed that. And politicians of other parties then said, you can't think about Scotland's future and where decision-making lies. And what happened then was we had 10 years of Tory austerity and were taken out of the European Union. That's what happened to you when you allow decisions to be taken for you by others. So in the fullness of time, when we're out of this crisis, thinking about these things, who's best to take the decisions about the future of Scotland is not a distraction from our recovery. It's essential to making sure that the recovery is the one we want and we're rebuilding the country the way we want it to be rebuilt. But nobody should be in any doubt about where my focus lies, just as it has every single day of the past year, as long as we are in this pandemic.
Willie Rennie, so the question is, should we get through the pandemic and start to recover before we think about another referendum?
Well, I think Jackie is right on the button. I think it's important to focus on the recovery. There's three areas, Jackie, that I think are incredibly important. One is mental health. We've got 1,500 young people who are waiting for mental health support for over a year. Now, we need to get mental health services back up to scratch again. I want to make them world leading. We need to focus on that. The second thing is we need reform of the social care sector. The social care workers have been in the front line through this pandemic. They've done an incredible job protecting elderly people, people who need care. They don't get paid enough. They need to get paid more to make it a sustainable position. And then we need bounce-back support for education. Children have lost out too much in education. They need to get extra support, a pupil equity fund supplement to make sure that we can give those from disadvantaged backgrounds, in fact, all children in school, the extra support they need to bounce back, because they are our future. All of that is going to take a huge amount of time to fix. We need everybody in this room to be focused on it. But I just know, I've seen a window into the next 5 years in the last few weeks. Arguments over the Constitution, strategy about independence, arguments between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, which have been poisonous and unpleasant. And what we need to do is to put all of that behind us and choose a different future. And if we can do that, we can tackle mental health, we can tackle education, but we can also make sure our social care workers get the pay that they deserve.
And I'll make sure everybody gets their say on whether we should have another referendum. But let's ask Cian first in the audience what he thinks of what he's heard.
You know, I am quite wondering, since it's been a point frequently made that it's too divisive and too time-consuming to hold a second referendum while we're in the midst of the COVID recovery, I do wonder if that doesn't speak on your ability, or perhaps lack of ability, to multitask while legislating. I don't personally see how that is that big of an issue.
Cian, thanks for that. To make sure everybody gets a shot, Lorna, are the Greens happy with the timetable that has been outlined by the SNP for another referendum within the first half of the next Parliament? So that's within 2.5 years.
I think it's really interesting that around the room we hear people who are in favour of the union not actually arguing for the union, but instead arguing that the people of Scotland shouldn't have the right to choose.
Yeah, but the question's about the timing and about recovery from the pandemic.
During COVID recovery, who do we want making the decisions? Do we want Boris Johnson, a government we didn't elect, making those decisions, or do we want those decisions for our recovery made in Scotland by a government that we've elected? It's not unreasonable. The Scottish Greens would support a referendum in this term of Parliament because we think decisions about Scotland should be made by the Scottish people.
And in the first half of this Parliament, though, within the next 2.5 years?
In our manifesto, we will call for it within this term of Parliament.
Douglas Ross.
So the point was, who's making the case for the union? Well, to go back to Jenny's point, Jenny's had both her COVID vaccinations. Jenny's one of 2.5 million almost people in Scotland who have had the first jab. Over 30 million people across the whole of the United Kingdom. That's the union working. The United Kingdom getting the vaccine. Working. The United Kingdom getting the vaccines that are then, delivered by our NHS staff, our British Armed Forces and our volunteers. I volunteered at a local vaccination site in Murray, and that's the union working for people right now. But to go back to Jackie's point, why are we having this debate about another referendum when we should be focused on our recovery? I agree. Why are we doing that? Why do we have bills in the Scottish Parliament to take forward another independence referendum, but not bills in the Scottish Parliament to support education, to restore our educational standards, to help businesses, to protect jobs? None of that is happening because the Scottish Government and the SNP are focused on another independence referendum. It takes away resources, it takes away attention from civil servants and politicians on their party priority, not the public's priority. And the question to Nicola Sturgeon is, when would you have this referendum? You've said now 3 times when the crisis has passed. So when is it? Your own MPs have said potentially this year. Others have said in the first half of this Parliament. Nicola Sturgeon, when do you want the referendum to be held?
My aim would be the first half of this Parliament.
So in the next 2.5 years?
Assuming the crisis is passed. But let me just take you on some of that. You said we hadn't passed legislation on social security. We have, alone in the UK, established the Scottish Child Payment, lifting children out of poverty. We have just confirmed that for the next financial year, businesses will get 100% rates relief. The UK government hasn't done that. We've gone way ahead there. We're spending more per pupil on education. We're spending more on health per head than the rest of the UK, and we've just made an offer to NHS staff of a 4% pay increase compared to the 1% insult that's been offered by the government in London. So these are the priorities we are focusing on each and every single day, and it's because we want to have more decisions like those capable of being made in Scotland that at the right time we want to give, as Lorna rightly says, the people of Scotland the right to choose. It's not up to any of us whether Scotland becomes independent or not. It's up to the people of Scotland to decide, and I don't know what it is about that choice that other politicians are so obviously nervous about.
So you've mentioned...
Hold on a second, and we need to get to Hannah Sauer, but first let's hear from Colin in our audience.
Hi there. I wouldn't want anyone on the panel there to think that the audience is against, they're not interested in constitutional issues, because we certainly are. There's lots of pejorative terms. You call us nationalists. I'd say we're interested in self-determination. You're unionists. You're nothing more than just imperialists wanting to rule, just like in the last century. You want to rule from London. I mean, the 3 Westminster parties, you're not even any more than branch offices in Scotland. You take your orders from Westminster.
Colin, we need to keep this respectful, but let me ask you a different question. There is, of course, now another party that will be competing for your vote, Alba. Are you tempted to vote for them with your second list vote?
No, I'm not. I'm also an engineer. I would vote. Will be voting Green my second vote, because the climate is massively important.
All right. So on the question of whether or not we should be through the pandemic before we think about another independence referendum, we haven't heard from you, Hannah Sauer.
I'll take it back to Jackie's question. And what I say to Colin is, we're in the middle of a pandemic. This isn't nationalists, unionists, Remainers, Brexiteers. It's mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, granddads, grandmoms, right across the country who are facing this challenge. And right at the start of this debate, I talked about not having to choose between treating a virus or treating cancer. And let me give you one practical example of how stark a challenge that is. Just this week, I spoke to the family of Mary. She's been diagnosed with a tertiary cancer and been told by the NHS in Scotland that due to the backlog because of COVID, they are not treating recurring cancers and are only operating on first cancers, meaning that she would not get her treatment in Scotland. And she's being forced to travel south in order to get that operation. That's what should be getting us exercised in this debate stage today. That's what we should be obsessing about. That's what a recovery plan needs to be about, not arguments about a referendum between Douglas and Nicola and everybody else. These are the things that matter to people across our country, and they don't care about the badges or the name calling that Colin's talking about. They care about having services that work for them, what Scotland can do, not what Scotland can't do.
Right, well, on the theme of what is going to happen with our NHS, we actually have a question from Zach Hassan.
Thanks, Sarah. Do the parties have a realistic plan to help the NHS deal with the backlog of surgeries, investigations and appointments created by the pandemic?
So, Hannah Sauer, you've outlined the problem. Do you have a plan for how to clear the backlog?
Absolutely. We have got to put a NHS restart plan at the heart of our COVID recovery. That means having a cancer restart plan. That means rapid diagnosis centres. It means dedicated surgeries for elective procedures so we can catch up on all those misdiagnoses we've had across the country. It means investing in mental health services. Willie gave one example of 1,500 children. On 25,000 occasions during this pandemic, one of our fellow citizens has built up the courage, picked up the phone, called a crisis mental health service, and the call has gone unanswered. That has devastating consequences for people across the country. So let's invest in mental health services, put them in GP practices, put them in workplaces, put them in college and university campuses across the country, as well as classrooms if we're going to handle the pandemic that's coming. And alongside that, let's resource the workforce. Our workforce was overworked and undervalued before the pandemic, even more so now. So I welcome the 4% pay rise for NHS staff. We've also got to give our social care staff a pay rise, and we've got to invest in the workforce so we have more of them so they are not overworked and overstretched. That's what should be dedicating our politics in the next 6 weeks, and that's the kind of parliament we need to have in the next 5 years.
Douglas Ross, do you have a realistic plan to help deal with the backlog, and what would you offer NHS staff as a pay rise?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to thank everyone working in the NHS who have gone above and beyond over the last 12 months. They have always been there for us, but even more so during this pandemic. And yes, we're coming close to 10,000 lives being lost here in Scotland as a result of COVID-19, and that's a figure that shames us all. That's 10,000 families and friends who have lost loved ones. But it would have been higher had it not been for the incredible efforts of our NHS staff. But we do need to look at the problems in the NHS right now, but also the problems pre-COVID-19, because this isn't a new issue. There were issues with the NHS long before this pandemic hit. You know, we had hospitals being built by the SNP that couldn't accept any patients. And it all goes back to when a government is focused on one issue, such as a referendum, they're not focused on our NHS. They're not focused on standing up for our NHS staff. They're not focused on getting down treatment times. The government's treatment time guarantee that Nicola Sturgeon's government introduced has never been met while she's been First Minister of Scotland. And if I could just very quickly go back to a couple of points.
Well, no, let me pick up on one thing just now, though. But Anas Sarwar said that he welcomed the 4% pay rise that the Scottish Government is offering. What would the Tories offer?
So I welcome the pay rise for our NHS staff, but we have to remember...
that will remain if there's a Tory government after this election.
I've said I welcome that, but we have to remember throughout this pandemic, our NHS staff, our nurses did incredible work, but so did many other key workers. My wife's a police officer. She's been on duty throughout this. My sister's a teacher, and they've done great work throughout the pandemic as well. And that's why I wanted to go back to Nicola Sturgeon's point, because she said in her previous answer about how she's been helping young people. Did it really help young people who've been out of school for the last year to offer them a free device at the start of an election campaign rather than at the start of the pandemic?
Well, at the start of the pandemic, we focused on getting free devices and internet connections to those most in need. So there was an audit done. It found that there were 70,000 young people who needed devices who didn't have them, and we provided the funding to make available so far just short of 70,000 devices.
And they
so I
didn't
think rightly and properly, those devices have been delivered to people in need. Rightly and properly at the start of the pandemic, we focused on those most in need. But looking ahead now, as we rebuild from this pandemic, we think it's right that every young person, regardless of the background, and the way I did when I went to school, got a jotter and a pencil, gets an electronic device. So that's a key commitment that we've made
when they've been working
for
at home
the next
for the
Parliament. The question, though, that Zach asked was about the National Health Service, and if I can, just before directly answering the question, in terms of the pre-COVID, when I stood here 5 years ago, doesn't feel like it, in the leaders' debates, I committed to us investing £500 million in real terms in the NHS over the life of this Parliament. We've actually done 3 times that, not including the COVID investment. So that's a sign of the way we were investing, reforming, integrating health and social care to start to bring down waiting times. COVID struck and has had a devastating impact on the ability of our NHS. It has performed magnificently, but to deal with non-COVID cases. So the question was, do we have a plan? You know, again, I've not been on the campaign trail today. I've been thinking about these very things. We are right now working on the plans to bring to bear temporary operating facilities, mobile units, to very quickly, or as quickly as possible, to bring down the backlog. Right now we have 6 permanent elective centres in train. We are planning, and there are 3 that will be operational by the end of May this year, fast-track cancer diagnostic centres. One of the issues with cancer diagnosis is that many people are not diagnosed early enough. Therefore, these new centres will look at people who have non-standard symptoms of cancer to try to get diagnosis more quickly. The point I'm making here is that for me, this is not just about plans to put forward at an election. This is work that is underway as we speak right now.
But there were supposed to have been 2 specialist cancer centres opened already, which if we're there possibly could have answered Anna's.
We said by the spring they will be open by the end of May, and we've actually gone from 2 to 3, and over the Parliament it will be our intention to have one in every single health board area.
So Cancer Research UK say there'll be 7,000 undiagnosed cancers across the country.
Absolutely.
Let's be very clear about that. That is 7,000 of our fellow citizens who have cancer, don't know they have cancer, can't start their treatment, and we know there's a direct link between speed of diagnosis, start of treatment and survival rates. And I've not heard the First Minister respond to the point I made about not treating tertiary cancers or secondary cancers in the country. That is completely unacceptable. We cannot have our fellow citizens not getting their basic cancer treatment. I recognise COVID has put challenges on, and I'm not negating that. I know our NHS staff continue to go above and beyond. But even despite COVID, cancer remains Scotland's biggest killer.
Absolutely.
And why we cannot have people having to travel south and 7,000 undiagnosed cancers.
Well, to go to the first point about tertiary cancers, that is not acceptable. That is part of the remobilisation plans that are underway. In terms of undiagnosed cancers, we have had for the last few years a Detect Cancer Early programme. The Fast Track centres are part of the next phase of that. We had to pause screening programmes because of COVID. They have all restarted, so people are starting. The Public Health Scotland have published figures today showing an increase in the most recent 3 months of urgent cancer referrals, so they're 15% up on the previous 3 months, still a bit below pre-COVID levels, but that recovery is now underway. And it's a really important point for all of us to get across that anybody who has worries about symptoms that could be indicative of cancer should come forward, because the NHS is open and there to care for you.
Not for me.
That is part of the remobilisation that we need to get underway and accelerate. It does take time. Our NHS has the pressure from COVID, thankfully, is now easing, and that's why we've got to keep COVID under control to make sure our beds and intensive care capacity is not overly consumed by COVID. But as that pressure eases, we can start to remobilise, taking account, of course, of the fact that many of those working in our NHS who've done such a magnificent job are tired and exhausted and traumatised by COVID, and we need to support them as we go into the remobilisation effort.
OK, let's just go to Ailey in the audience first.
Hi there. I have a personal kind of interest in this as a trans woman. Waiting lists for trans healthcare have been over a year pre-COVID. I had to wait 14 months to see a specialist for my first appointment. Gender identity clinics are one of the most underfunded parts of the NHS. And I was just wondering if the panel had any comments on how to, speed up waiting lists, especially in trans healthcare.
Willie Rennie.
Yes, absolutely, Ailey. It does need to improve. It's not good enough. It needs to have parity with the rest of the NHS, and it needs that support, and I can give you that commitment. I will argue for that to happen. I mean, there's no pretending that the pandemic has knocked our NHS sideways. It's created massive long waiting lists. So how do we deal with it? At the fundamental end, we need to make sure that primary care has the proper investment. We need to have mental health services that are up to scratch, because they put huge pressure on the NHS. But we also need to make sure that we never go back to the days of massive long delayed discharge. People stuck in hospital because there wasn't the social care place for them in the community. So we need to get the social care sector up and running. Then we need to put the professionals in charge of setting the targets and the ambitions for dealing with the backlog of operations, because they are best placed to meet the targets, to set the targets, to use the new technology that's been made available now. The Near Me technology that the NHS are using extensively now is saving a huge amount of time and effort, means that more people can get access to services. So we need to use the technology, we need to use the professionals, we need to make sure that mental health services are up to scratch so they're not putting the pressure on the rest of the NHS. Social care sector, never go back to the way that we were. But also we need to recognise the pandemic has been huge. It will not be a quick fix, but we need to make the investment so that we can never go back to this situation. So just one more thing. We were promised that nobody would wait longer than 12 weeks. It was a legal guarantee agreed by the First Minister when she was Health Secretary. That's been breached 300,000 times. And that was before the pandemic.
80,000 times.
That was, has it gone up? It's gone up now.
times.
But that was before the pandemic. Now, that is unacceptable. The NHS was running on hot before this came along. That can never be allowed to happen again. And that's why we need to focus on putting the recovery for the NHS first.
OK, let's hear from David on our panel.
Hi, good evening. Money is going to be tight for the next Parliament anyway. The entire economy has been thrown at the recovery so far and getting us through COVID. Wouldn't it be better? Just imagine how much we could accomplish if we all came together, if we targeted the hospitals with the money that would otherwise be spent on setting up an independent Scotland, the billions that would be spent, targeting the faults in education, targeting the faults that we've got in hospitals, in social care, in mental health, as other panellists and other people have said. Why do we have to look forward to going back to the old ways? It's time for a new thing. For me, education is a silver bullet. Education is everything. It doesn't need little changes, it needs massive changes. But that can only be done when the entire attention of the government is on fixing this. Fix the pandemic. It's going to take not 5 years. It's not going to take 10 years. It's going to take much longer than that.
David, thanks very much for that. Lorna.
Hi, David. I'm afraid I disagree with you about there being a shortage of money. Every single party is committed to an investment-led recovery. The question is, what are we investing in? We know that in Westminster, Boris Johnson can find the money to buy nuclear weapons and a new plane, I think, with more Union Jacks on it, but he couldn't find the money to give nurses a fair pay rise. Only 1%. I'm delighted to hear that Anna Sarwar approves of the pay rise that the Scottish Greens won for our public sector workers in negotiation with the Scottish Government. These are the kind of things we need to do. We need to work together and agree on policy. I'm also glad to hear that there is cross-party consensus for a national care service. This will absolutely reduce the pressure on the NHS and allow it to help recover from this pandemic. I think that the voters like to see when parties work together on policies like a national care service that will benefit everybody, and I very much look forward to doing that in the next Parliament.
Let's hear from Juan in our audience.
Hi, good evening. First of all, thank you for having me tonight. It's the first time I'm going to be voting, and this is thanks to the change in the Scottish Electoral Bill. Only one party voted against people like us having the right to vote, which I don't know why. I have been living 21 years in the United Kingdom.
When you say people like us, do you mean citizens of the European Union?
And that was a Conservative party, you know, the party that Douglas Ross leads. They voted against us to having the right to vote. But democracy is very important for me. I am originally from Chile and lived under dictatorship. So the question of having the right to vote and decide our future for me is not a drama. I don't like other politicians telling the people from Scotland don't want a referendum. There are many who do want the referendum. It's about having the time and organizing ourselves to do so. But in order to ask your question so that all of you could answer and see how much you really want to work together, my question here is, will you agree in the next Parliament term to vote forward of a unique and basic income for everyone in this country so that we can start the recovery in equal terms? And also, what are your priorities to have a green recovery? The climate is not a game. It's something that's going on right now. And we need answers from you guys to see what are you really committed to do in this Parliament.
Juan, thank you very much for that, Juan. We'll run round the panel quickly. Now, it's a huge topic, a universal basic income, which is a proposal that the government guarantees a certain minimum income to every citizen. We probably haven't got time to get into all the whys and wherefores of it now, so let's go for a yes, no. Universal basic income, Douglas Ross.
No, I've looked at what the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and others have said, and I'm not convinced by the argument on a universal basic income, but I am convinced...
That's an answer. Come on, let's do basic income first, Lorna.
And then come back.
The Scottish Greens are committed to working towards a universal basic income and will support trials of it during the next Parliament.
Willie Rennie?
Yes, and we argued for it through the pandemic, which would have been an ideal time to pilot it, to make sure that no one was left behind. There was thousands of people missed out on support. This could have solved that.
Anas Sarwar, Labour for a universal basic income?
I support trials of UBI. Actually, we missed an opportunity. The pandemic was a perfect opportunity for us to trial it across the country.
Was it?
We've been supporting some local authorities to look and explore it. I support it. I'm very supportive of it, and the pandemic has made me more supportive of it. The reality is, without full control over tax and social security, you can't do it fully in Scotland, but without giving away my manifesto, we will set out in our manifesto how we will try to take some steps towards that, even within the powers that the Parliament currently has. One's point about working together, I think, is an important one. As First Minister, I think with the exception of the Conservatives, who never want to work with us, we've worked with all of the parties here. We've worked with the Greens on budgets. We worked with the Liberals on this budget, got more money for mental health. We've worked with one of Anas's colleagues to introduce free period products. So working together is a really good thing. And the final point about One is we have changed the law. So everybody who is legally resident in Scotland gets the chance to vote. And I think that is a symbol and a sign of the open, inclusive country that we are.
Very briefly.
I don't want to work with a party that's going to separate our country, that's going to divide families and communities all over again. And that's what David was saying. David was saying this is a risk for the next 5 years, is that we're dominated by this constitutional politics. But it's not the next 5 years.
We disagree on the
Constitution, if I can just finish, because Nicola Sturgeon has confirmed tonight that she wants another referendum in the next 2 years. The next 2 years, when we're still dealing with this health pandemic, when we're still trying to recover our economy, Nicola Sturgeon has confirmed to everyone watching tonight that the SNP will take us forward into another independence referendum if they get that majority. But we can stop them like we stopped them in 2016. And the final point I was going to say, Sarah, is Nicola Sturgeon was also saying look out for what's going to be in her manifesto. And I will, because I'll look out to what it's going to say about council tax, because every time Nicola Sturgeon has been elected...
We've frozen council tax.
She's promised to reform council tax.
In England later this week, the average...
You're using topics that have not come from the audience. We need to leave... No. Just take the heat out of this a little bit for now. We're going to move on.
An average of 4%. In Scotland, it is frozen in every single council area because of the
manifestos to reform council tax. Why are people still paying council tax?
Other parties voted against abolishing the council tax. We are freezing council tax this year.
You were a majority government for 5 years.
Increasing it in the teeth of a pandemic.
Nobody can hear you if you all speak over each other. It's doing no service to the voters at all who are trying to find out what your policies on this are. And once we finish here at 9 o'clock, you will be able to see an analysis of everything that's been discussed tonight on the 9 on the BBC Scotland channel, and you can continue to follow the debate on social media using the hashtag BBC Leaders Debate. But let's move on to our next question now, and we're going to take that from Danielle Gray.
As Glasgow prepares to host the COP26 climate conference, what will you do to ensure Scotland's contribution to reducing the global rate of warming to pre-industrial levels?
Lorna Slater, that seems an appropriate one to come to you on.
That's right up our alley, Danielle. Thank you for asking. You're absolutely right. The climate crisis is got to be our #1 concern, and only the Scottish Greens have a plan, have the solutions to the climate crisis. The situation is so serious that we have to not just dabble around the corners, not make half-hearted attempts. We have to, as the climate strikers say, do everything all at once now. We have to drive emissions down to zero as quickly as we are able to, and at the same time, absorb out of the atmosphere carbon that is already there. And the best way to do that is by restoring Scotland's natural landscapes, reforestation, making our wetlands healthy again. So let's work together to do those things, but driving down the emissions is key. And it's policies like the ones I mentioned before, massive investment in renewable energy, upgrading Scotland's trains and upgrading Scotland's homes. These are all policies that create jobs, boost the economy and reduce the emissions. They're almost no-brainers. By putting in place these sorts of practical, costed things, we can tackle the climate crisis and make sure young people like you have a future.
Douglas Ross, where in your manifesto will you be talking about reducing global warming rates to pre-industrial levels?
Well, we're going to hear a lot of warm words from all the different parties, but I also think we need to see action, because it's action that Danielle's looking for. It's action that my son's generation are going to expect from this generation of politicians to leave the country and our environment in a better state than we got it in. And that's why we believe you've got to work together. We need to work collaboratively and constructively. I think it's great.
You were just saying you wouldn't work with any party that wanted to.
I'm not going to work with a party that's going to divide our country, and I'll come back to that.
Even on climate change.
And I hope Nicola Sturgeon's Scottish Government will work with the UK Government on the North Sea transition deal. The first country in the G7 to have a transition deal to protect jobs and to protect the environment, to transition from oil and gas into more renewable forms of energy. £16 billion going to support that, to protect jobs.
More money for the oil and gas companies.
Well,
more money to an already heavily subsidised industry.
In the northeast of Scotland.
Are you still going to be giving out oil and gas licences? We can't keep emitting. We have to stop. There needs to be a plan to stop.
Tens of thousands of jobs protected with the transition deal for the northeast from oil and gas into more renewable energy. That's the type of action that can have real lasting effect. But that's the type of action, and those are the types of jobs that are under threat with Nicola Sturgeon and another drive towards another referendum.
Is it going to be fast enough? At what point do you think we would stop extracting oil from the North Sea and move to renewables?
We've absolutely got to work for that transition period. For the oil and
Within
gas,
the next Parliament?
With the oil and gas workers right now, who have gone through a lot in this pandemic, the collapse in the oil price, it was $113 a barrel in Nicola Sturgeon's last white paper.
We understand the problems for the industry, but for the climate's sake, at what point would we stop extracting oil from the North Sea?
That's why we're working with the industry right now and have been, and that's why the United Kingdom is the first country anywhere in the G7 to have this transition deal. £16 billion to support that transition while still protecting the vital jobs that rely on it.
Anna Sarwar, can we continue to take oil out of the North Sea and have any hope of reducing global warming to pre-industrial levels?
I'll come to that in a moment, but I've got to say, dear Douglas, and this shows you why this election is so important, because let's not just have a parliament that's against things. I don't support independence, I don't support a referendum, but actually having an opposition that's going to try and push us towards a recovery, push us towards ideas to make us a better country is also really, really important. And we can't just have a group of Tories who want to just talk about division, only shout about the Constitution, and put no ideas forward at all.
We want to stop the division and stop the SNP. Why don't you?
I agree we've got a failing government, but we've also got a game-playing, childish opposition. That's why we need a better government and we need a better opposition. And to the important point about the green recovery, we have an opportunity in November when the world is going to be watching Glasgow. The world is going to be watching Glasgow. It's a huge economic opportunity for us that we need to grasp coming through COVID, so it helps our economic recovery. But it's also a chance for us to recognise that climate change doesn't see borders and we can be global leaders. And I want us to come through COP26 and have agreed the Glasgow Agreement, a historic agreement that shows the world is finally taking the climate emergency seriously. And what does that mean in terms of practical action? It means investment in green jobs. It means investment in public transport. It means diversifying how we transport public transport across the country. It means investing in young people. Douglas mentions his children. Our children are going to call us into question about what we did to challenge the climate emergency. Our children are more alive to this than previous generations have ever been. We have got to harness that energy and make sure COP26 shows the best of Glasgow and the best of Scotland.
Well, it's noticeable amongst our panel, as many of the younger members who've got their hands in the air. Danielle, you asked the question. What do you think of what you've heard so far?
I am a bit surprised by Douglas Ross's response. I think to have an attitude like that towards the climate crisis isn't really what's going to get young people to believe in his party. I think that Anna Sarwar's come across really well in his policies and his commitment to listening to young people. But I think there does need to be extreme action taken because, as was said earlier, that we don't have long to fix this problem, and we can't wait much longer. It needs to happen now.
Emily, in our audience, what do you make of what you've heard?
Hi. I think it's quite shocking. We really need to do something because as young people, we're quite scared about it. And I was just thinking that throughout my entire education, I used plastic, single-use cutlery in the canteens. We had paper printouts for everything that were just thrown away. So I wanted to know what you would do to make schools more environmentally friendly and sustainable.
Nicola Sturgeon, a plan to reduce the global rate of warming to pre-industrial levels.
I'll come on to that, but can I just address the point from Emily there? I think young people are driving this, and we want to see the curriculum for excellence in our education system is all about educating young people to be responsible citizens. And in my experience, young people are the ones that will make people of my generation take the action that is necessary. In terms of a plan, firstly, and I'm not saying this to rest on our laurels, but because I think it should motivate us. Scotland is already leading the world. We've halved our emissions already from 1990. 97% of our electricity already comes from renewable sources. So we should take that as motivation to go further. We've got some of the most stretching targets in the world. We will end our contribution to climate change by becoming net zero emissions by 2045 with a 75% reduction target by 2030. So we've got to take the actions to meet those targets. We've got to match what we've done in electricity in other areas. That means firstly decarbonising how we heat our homes. Our manifesto will have a massive programme of investment proposed for decarbonising heat. We've got to do more to cut transport emissions. I want to see us reduce car kilometres by 20% at least by 2030. Decarbonise our railways. One of our commitments in this election is to take a railway into public ownership to help us to do that, invest more in public transport. And Lorna's right about the natural environment. More than 80% of all the trees planted in the UK are planted in Scotland. We're investing more in reforestation, in restoring peatlands. So we, in December last year, published the updated climate change plan. There's 100 new policies in that, 40 policies where we up the scale of ambition. But this takes all of us to work together and to work with Civic Scotland. And let me say, I'll work with anybody in Parliament and outside of Parliament to make sure that we meet that moral obligation, because it is a moral obligation to end our contribution to climate change.
Now, I'm continuing to talk to Willie Rennie about climate change, but first let's hear from Jim.
Hi. One of the topics there about climate change, and we heard from the Greens about how they would want to stop oil and gas exploration. But we hear from all the parties about investing in different things, investing in education, investing in health, investing in jobs. But we don't hear anything from any of the parties about how they're going to pay for it. And oil and gas, despite the fact there are issues found about the planet, contribute significantly to the Scottish economy. So how are we going to pay for all the promises that the different politicians are making?
We will try to ask them. Let's hear from Marjorie first.
So just to support the previous comment, if we are to take on board our share of the public debt, the unprecedented public debt that has come as a consequence of COVID, in circumstances where we separate from the UK, then we would have to factor in also that debt to our future plans. So without any quarrel about the ambition of the plans, how does that square up with paying off public debt that we would inherit and for money that we have spent?
Willie Rennie, it comes down to, can we afford to tackle climate change?
Yes, we can't afford not to. I mean, we've had a national purpose through the pandemic. The country's come together, put a huge effort in, made massive sacrifices. We need the same national purpose to deal with the climate change. It's given us a big jolt. It's shown that we don't actually have to head around the country all the time in cars. It shows that we can actually do an awful lot more remotely. We've got tremendous assets in this country. You know, whether it's the peat bogs that absorb so much of the carbon, or the forests that we're planting, or whether it's the renewable energy sources, whether it's offshore wind, onshore, we need to exploit all of those opportunities. But what's crucial in terms of how to pay for this, because this can't be like the transition in previous generations where people have lost out. We need to make sure that the workers get the jobs for the future. And that's why it's a travesty that we're about to build a whole, I think it's 114 wind turbines off the Scottish coast. Now, the BIFAB production facility bid for 4 and got none. Now, we cannot afford to have these massive jackets built on the other side of the planet and shipped all the way over here for the workers at Methil to see them getting built and not have any of the jobs.
Absolutely.
So we need to have the just transition to make this work, but we can't afford not to do it.
All right, Willie Rennie, thank you for that. Now, we just have a few minutes left of the programme, so I'm just going to ask each of you. I think we all know that public discourse has never been more tribal or more polarised than it feels at the moment. So I'm interested, will you make a pledge to swiftly tackle any abusive behaviour that is going on through this election that takes place in your party's name? Who would like to answer that first?
Unequivocally, yes.
Yes.
Unequivocally, yes.
And that means people who are taking to social media, for instance, who may or may not be members of your party, it may take you a while to check that out, you will say you are not helping, or you will call them out if they are rude or name-calling to people who support other parties.
Sarah, we can't pick and choose on these issues. I know from the women that are on the panel, they'll know from my own experiences as a ethnic minority in politics, is that we can't pick and choose. Doesn't matter where it comes from or who it's directed towards. Whether they're on our side or on a different side, we have a duty to condemn those perpetrators, and we have a duty to show solidarity with the victims. And that's a cast iron commitment from me, because some things go beyond our party politics, and challenging prejudice and hatred has to go beyond our party politics.
Willie Rennie?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's depressing that we get to such a state in Scottish politics that we have to resort to abuse to get our points across. And I think we've all got to respond. I think we all agree. I think we've got to work together, stand together. When Anis was abused the other day, we all stood with him against the abuser. And I think that we need to do that every single time. There will be people in all our parties that do this, but how we react is incredibly important. And I can guarantee I will act the right way.
And Douglas Ross, as a party leader, do you have a responsibility to set the tone and to try and make sure that people don't think that they're helping your party by abusing people who don't support it?
Yes, and we all do. And I think we will all agree that we would take urgent action if that was highlighted. Just today, I was doing an interview outside the Scottish Parliament, and one person walked past saying they wanted to shoot me, and another person wanted a socially distant selfie. And that's the nature of Scottish politics just now. We are so divided. And I just wonder why Scottish Labour can't understand the threat we're facing, because every single question from our audience today has gone back from education, our economy, on health service. It all goes back to the distraction of a referendum. So the audience get it. Why don't you?
Can I say?
Nicholas,
let me respond to this, because it's an issue we're talking about. Prejudice in our society.
But why is
Douglas,
it there?
you know I don't support independence, and you know I don't support a referendum, but you are... Grow up. Have you not noticed we're in the midst of a pandemic? Have you not noticed that 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their life? Have you not noticed the scale of the challenge our country faces? And you come to this stage on an issue, a question of prejudice and hate, when we are trying to come together as one. You can't help bring in your own...
Because every single audience questioned it. Every single audience questioned it. That's the threat.
Utterly shameful.
Lorna, what can politicians do to try to raise the tone of the debate so that we can discuss respectfully with people with whom we disagree without abusing them?
I have very strong opinions about this, and part of it, I think, is that we need to have a parliament that really reflects the people of Scotland. We need to have gender balance in parliament. We need more women. When we have too many old, wealthy, white men making decisions, they make decisions in a certain way, and we need to move on. More women involved in decision-making, more ethnic minorities, more disabled people, more trans people. We need a parliament that really looks like Scotland, and that's why I'm proud that I'm part of a candidate list that's 70% women that we've brought to the Scottish Parliament, because we are committed to correcting that balance and make sure the Parliament is truly representative.
Thank you. And Nicholas Sturgeon, I mean, there are a lot of your own supporters indulge in abusing people who don't agree with them.
Yeah, and I will call that out whenever it needs to be called out. I think it's really important we all recognise our responsibility for this, and that we don't just call it out when it's another party doing it. And we try, you know, none of us are perfect on this, but the experience of the pandemic in the last year has changed my perspective on some of this, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. But let's rise to the occasion. Let's try to, given the legitimate differences between us, focus on what we can agree on and not use something like this as an opportunity to criticise and attack somebody who probably gets more abuse on social media than most of us. So, you know, let's all, not just in our rhetoric, but in how we behave, try to rise to the occasion of having civilised discourse. There's nothing wrong in a democracy with passionately disagreeing. That's the essence of democracy. But let's do it in a civilised and respectful way.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. That's all we have time for tonight. The coverage of the debate and the campaign continues right across the BBC. You can keep up to date with the very latest on our website if you visit bbc.co.uk/Election Scotland. There's also some handling guides to the issues there, as well as more information on topics like how the voting system works. Now, I want to thank all of the virtual audience for taking part, for their questions and for their contributions, and also say thank you to all 5 of the party leaders for their time and for their answers. I hope tonight has perhaps helped you a bit on your way to deciding who you might vote for in just over 5 weeks' time. Until then, stay safe and thank you for watching. Thank you all for taking